We still believed in the power of education and that we were doing good work. We all had a place on the map that we thought was home, but we didn't know where it was or if we were sure about it, and we were exhausted.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Education Vanguard. I'm Dr. Howard Stribbell, and it's my pleasure to be hosting the 21st Century Learning podcast this day and to be able to introduce you to Patrick Hurworth. Patrick Hurworth has been a principal and a head of school for a number of years. We met many years ago on the activist board. We were both serving on that. And now a few years later, this is a great opportunity for us to reflect what our leadership journeys have been like, what have we learned since then, and maybe I'll just let you introduce yourself since that'll be much easier.
Thank you, Howard, and thanks for inviting me here this afternoon. So Patrick Hurworth first went into the world of international education in 1996, the last century, where I started at the International School of Geneva. And then after that, appeared in the United States in Atlanta International School, and then moved to Asia in 2014, Hong Kong, China, where I first met you, where I was the head of school at the International School of Beijing, which was my first headship, and where we served together on the ACAMIS board, surrounded by a great deal of horsepower and the other board members there and experience. And then subsequent stints in Singapore and India as a head of school as well. And this last academic year and now as well, I've been serving as a consultant in different areas. Safeguarding in schools, philanthropy as well. And also, I spent a few months working for the Hong Kong China Rugby Union as their compliance manager, which isn't a sentence I never thought I'd hear myself say, but nevertheless, it's true. So yeah, not full-time in a school at the moment, but hopefully making a decent contribution to the dialogue around well-being and safeguarding.
Absolutely.
And leadership in general.
You've had a very interesting career. And I'm really excited that you're going to be taking part in the 21st Century Learning Conference coming up in the spring of 2027. You're going to be adding a mental health and well-being strand to the conference as well. That's exciting. We'll talk more about that at the end of the podcast. So make sure you guys stay tuned so that you hear about those.
Both of you.
Both of you. Hi, Mom.
Yeah. My mom promised.
ACAMIS is a really good example of a support system. I was a brand new head when I joined ACAMIS. Andy Page Smith at Hong Kong Academy brought me in, and I was in awe of these stalwarts of leadership that I got to learn from. That was your first head of school position in Beijing, even though you had held some senior positions before that. But yeah, being connected with other heads of schools and senior leaders is definitely very helpful, isn't it?
There's no question, in good times and less good times. And I think one of the things that brought us together on the ACAMIS board, for example, not just that group, but those people connected with ACAMIS, was the challenges of the initial outbreak of COVID-19,
That's right.
where it was all hands on deck. And so absolutely right. And I know that there are a significant number of formal structures in the ways in which heads can connect. But there's also something to be said for those informal structures as well.
I think sometimes those informal structures pay off even more, right?
Yeah.
There's those friendships and connections. You've got the formal structure, but when stuff kind of hits the fan and you have no one else to talk to, it definitely helps to be able to pick up a phone or send an email to one of the other heads that you've connected with and can ask them, have you ever experienced this? Or what do you think I should do?
Yeah.
That's been good.
And one of the things that's very reassuring is that sometimes that happens spontaneously. Someone will hear that a school is going through a particularly challenging time, and you'll hear from someone out of the blue. You did that for me when we had a particularly sad moment in the school in Singapore. So that network is there. I think one of the things that possibly challenges it from becoming more sophisticated is that we're still, as individuals, a little bit edgy about admitting vulnerability. What's the impact onto the reputation of the school if you're acknowledging that something's not as it should be? What's the impact on your own reputation if you show your cards? At the same time, there is no perfect head of school, and it's a lonely job at times. So the more we can support each other,
Very true.
the better. Now, I also don't want to get too precious, because there'll be people watching this possibly in their hundreds who aren't heads of school. And we're talking about well-being, we're talking about mental health. And I don't want us to underestimate, for example, the challenge of mental health and well-being of a kindergarten teacher who's got 22 kids in a class and who has a responsibility to teach them how to read and write.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas being a head of school can be a demanding role, it also comes with some privilege. And I think sometimes we can overemphasize how demanding that is when we look at the challenges that our colleagues face as well.
In your experience with the different schools you've worked with, or the schools you're now working with in safeguarding, what are some of the things that schools are getting right? And what are some of the things that schools maybe are missing when it comes to student wellness, safeguarding, mental health? role?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that comes to mind automatically is I did some training with Kevin Bartlett once upon a time. He used to run us through an exercise where we used to say, we now know this, and yet we continue to do this in a school. For example, it's really difficult still for us to walk away from high stakes assessments such as GCSEs or IB diploma or A-levels. Many schools have tried, many schools have done it quite successfully. The one in Singapore, we stepped away from the IGCSEs in part because we thought we could offer something that was more engaging and meaningful to students, but in part because those high stakes assessments, the GCSEs, were set out at a time which is now no longer really relevant to our young people, and adding undue pressure and stress at that stage. So that's one example. So what do we do well? I think increasingly we are sophisticated in our dialogue around social emotional learning and safeguarding. I think one of the challenges that any school would face is having dialogue with board members and parents that it's not an either or proposition, that if you are to invest heavily in dialogue and work around SEL, there is a presumption that it's going to detract from something else rather than viewing it in the additive model. I think safeguarding and social emotional learning are foundational to the success of the students in whichever dimension you want to use, academic, but also in terms of their mental well-being, their wellness in general. And how we close that gap in the understanding and the sort of shared commitment is something, I guess, that we're trying to do in the micro discussions, conferences, consultants. But we had an experience in the school in India where a girl died by suicide on our campus. And one of the questions I was asked immediately afterwards by parents was, how will you make sure this doesn't happen again? So obviously my response in a very respectful tone was, I can't. At the same time, as a school, I think we should all be engaged in dialogue around what do we know is best for students' wellness and well-being, and why aren't we doing as much of it as we possibly can? The outdoor education program at the United World College in Singapore, and there are many schools that invest in outdoor ed. They did a great deal of work with the University of Portland in terms of the researching the impact of outdoor education on young people, and came up with some real concrete metrics to show that students who are engaged in outdoor education are better, are healthier. That's not news to you.
Yeah, we have the Forbicia, we have the off-seas conference and community of all these outdoor education educators and providers. And wow, the stories that come out of that conference of the stuff that's happening all year round is amazing. You're building wonderful character traits.
Absolutely right. And how we convince boards that can sometimes be very dominated by parents. And that's not a sort of damning phrase, but sometimes their needs or their focus can be quite limited and short term, with leadership that changes quite rapidly in some cases. And when the focus is always going to be on, to a degree, as it should be, on academic outcomes. But again, I think part of our challenge is always going to be, it's not an either or proposition. It's not a zero-sum game. It's the power of and.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, probably the prime responsibility now of school leaders is to lead that dialogue.
And I think coming back to something you said at the beginning is that it has to be integrated. That way it becomes foundational. When it's just on the periphery, it can be an add-on. It's probably going to fail. And I think people don't appreciate it. I'm a little bit ashamed to admit this, but I remember saying around mindfulness, as long as I'm the head of the school, there won't be any colorful expletive mindfulness in the school, because it was just seen as frivolous and fluffy. And that wasn't what I felt our parents wanted.
I was just going to mention the mindfulness aspect. So exactly right. I'm not sure I use the same language, but I'm from the same generation. How do we fit this in? How do we make it real? There's a school I visited recently in Southeast Asia that has this very, very bold, strong commitment to mindfulness, admirably. And one of their challenges is, how do we make that now integral to the program so that they don't have to have the conversations with the teachers or the parents of yes, but.
Yes.
That it really is foundational to what they do. So this goes back to possibly my Kevin Bartlett comment. We know that mindfulness has an impact on well-being and therefore on outcomes. So why don't we? There's nowhere to hide anymore now in terms of that sort of dialogue. It doesn't mean everyone has to rush to mindfulness per se. But when we do have some strong evidence as to how to make our students healthier and our adults healthier, not to engage in dialogue as to how that's relevant to your school seems to me now to be negligent.
Yeah, negligent is a powerful word, but I think you're right there. And it's the full scope of things. I think most schools and leaders would agree child safeguarding is essential. It has to be there. If it's not there, that's a red flag. And I think our accrediting bodies are doing a good job of really forcing people to take that seriously. I think, and informally, people do take child safeguarding seriously, but they don't have the practices and policies in place to really shore it up. But then when we widen that scope into mindfulness, into social emotional learning, most people would agree it's good for the kids and it needs to be there. But are we having enough conversation around what that mental wellness looks like for the adults in the school, and also the impact on leaders?
Yeah, my first blush response would be we're not, but I don't want to be disrespectful to the school. The Institute for Social Emotional Learning is running a training program in Kuala Lumpur in September, and its whole focus is SEL for adults, as an example. So there may be many others doing the same, but that's very encouraging to see. But we're not doing enough. And again, I think one of the challenges as a head of school, a school leader, is when you engage with dialogue around that to the board and the parents, sometimes it can be seen as, sometimes people lurch back into what I perceive to be tired, somewhat crass sound bites of they get a lot of holiday. And
right,
it's that to those who can't teach type thinking, which of course should have gone out in the trash. I was within earshot of a school leader at some time ago in a particular context. And this person used the phrase, at the end of every semester, I like to think of the teachers leaving some blood on the floor. And student well-being is directly correlated to adult well-being. That's not new. And if we focus entirely on student well-being, while we miss the adult aspect, then that's a false economy. So we're not doing enough. What we do is contextual, it's related to the budget, it's related to the beliefs and values of the organization. I was very fortunate in Beijing with the board at one particular era where I advocated that we hire a full-time counselor for our colleagues, a therapist.
Okay.
And in fact, I asked for 2. And I was about to be granted 2, and then COVID hit.
Then you needed 4.
Yeah, exactly right. And I still stand by that. Now, obviously, not every school is necessarily situated to be able to do something like that in terms of their resources. And it's not a cynical move. It has an actual functional purpose, of course. But I have a belief also that if you go back to what makes teachers feel well or positive about an environment, it's a sort of sense of certainty and a sense of psychological safety. And if they know that they're working in an environment where the board and the leadership team are taking their well-being seriously, it allows them to breathe a little bit and relax into the role.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah, I put a post out on LinkedIn that said, school wellness, a free green smoothie on Friday is not enough.
Yeah, free yoga. Yeah.
It has to be something more than that.
Yeah.
Now, I also wonder if international schools...
Although I take the smoothie.
Yes, if international schools are also unique than, let's say, domestic schools, because we could be criticized. We're highly affluent families, high-performing students with a lot of privilege relative to the local context. Do we really need that much more support? We're already getting a head start on things. And I think there's some truth there. I think our schools are getting pretty good at understanding privilege and what's our responsibility towards privilege. But I also liken it to an elite athlete needs a lot of support to keep developing. They need the massage, the hyperbaric chamber. They need all these extra things to keep performing, and they're carrying heavier loads, and there's much heavier expectations. I've definitely seen in our students at our international schools, the expectations on them from their parents are enormous. I didn't have that when I was growing up. As long as I didn't burn the place down, I was pretty much free.
You should never have done the second time.
Second time, yeah. Then I was pretty much free to do what I wanted and to choose whatever career or university I wanted. But our students face a lot of pressure within their family, within their community as well.
In all of the countries in which I've worked, there's a broad range of cultures. Every parent with whom you meet to tell them that their child is harming themselves are heartbroken. And everyone wants the best for their child. And certainly we do see some parents who we would perceive to be over the top about it. You know, the IVs, the college, the IB results, the number of co-curriculars they get involved with. It's a bit of a sort of hackneyed tale, but it's often true. And they themselves, on that end of the continuum, they are always heartbroken if they find out that their son or daughter is not eating enough or is self-harming. So again, how do we bring the dialogue around, it's not a zero-sum game. If you are well, you can perform better. We all know that. We know that in the workplace, not just as educators, but if you're working in a corporate setting, you know that if you're being bullied by your boss, you're not going to do your best work. You know that if you're working all hours of the day, you're not going to do your best work. Right. What's the disconnect? And I think part of the disconnect is that schools individually and collectively still are nervous about if we tweak this part of the dashboard, we move that particular part of the machinery, are we going to see a downtick in the outcomes? Right. And sometimes these changes which are so vital, there may be some data that comes out at the end of the year or at the end of the next year that you don't like the look of. But if doing the right thing is the right thing. So the high expectations, absolutely right. We're paid adults. We have a contract. We've committed to doing the best for kids. And there should be high expectations of us as individuals and us as a body of professionals. And there should be an understanding that the way we perform at work, high expectations, high support.
High support.
And you can't have one without the other. You can, but then that's the road.
It usually doesn't last very long.
Yeah, that's not a sustainable environment, really. Yeah, that's the sort of environment, as you know, that teachers will leave and then parents ask questions. Yeah.
One of the things that I found challenging as a head of school, there's always the ongoing pressure, the many moving pieces. There's definitely the student well-being, and you're going to have issues that come up and staffing issues. But when those big crises hit and you're already operating at near capacity level anyways, and this crisis comes in, which really affects lives, it could affect the future of the school, it could potentially be very public, not just national, regional, it could be national, it could be international kind of news. As the head of school, you're the one spearheading how to handle that crisis. And I did not feel prepared for that. One, the types of decisions I had to make. Two, the weight of carrying that responsibility on my shoulders. And I don't think we train our young leaders well enough in how to handle those things.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Yeah. And until you're in a position where you do have full responsibility for managing a crisis, however that's defined, learning on the job is hard.
You get conflicting information, right?
Yeah.
You get one hand that says, be transparent.
Yeah.
This is a perfect example where it is not time to be transparent. You need to have clarity and transparency with maybe the head and the board chair or the owner, the families that are directly affected, and then a controlled narrative or a controlled description of what's happening to those affected.
Yeah.
And then if we get further and further away from the center, you get less and less details out there, and you try to control what's happening as much as possible.
And I think you'll never get it right. It's degrees of right or degrees of wrong.
Yes.
And I think most of us are anyway, but certainly when it comes to crisis management, you go into it wholeheartedly with your team. And it does depend somewhat on the nature of the crisis. But I would possibly loosely define a crisis as anything that's really impacting the well-being of a student or students and the adults. There's financial crises which are problematic and important, and at the same time they don't quite have the same emotion or
I can handle
a
downturn of 10-20% on the budget and I need to find $1 million in my back pocket somewhere.
You've got to stop asking me then. That didn't work last time.
That didn't work. I got to find new strategies.
Yeah.
But those things we can handle. They're stressful, but they don't have that emotional impact that a student crisis will have.
But I advocate strongly, possibly reflecting on my own experiences, for you look at places like the Principals Training Centre, which is excellent, and I enjoyed my time there. And I might be out of date, but who's running sessions like that for crisis management for aspiring leaders, practicing role-playing? We partnered in Beijing with an organization that came in and did role-play situations on intruders, on other crises, and the real thing is the real thing.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you've muscle memory, it does help.
Definitely helps. When a crisis hit, it exposes what you haven't prepared for.
Yeah.
If you don't have your policy in place, you don't have your crisis management and communication team in place, you don't have those clear lines of reporting in place. It can even be, we used bird flu days, SARS days, and then COVID. We eventually learned we needed to have digital thermometers in the warehouse. You needed to have hand sanitizer. You needed to have masks stored up, right? You can't just be finding that stuff at the last minute. And I remember too, realizing how much it affected my staff. I didn't realize how much it affected me until later on. But I remember my head counselor coming to me. We were supporting a staff member who needed ongoing support over a number of weeks in a very, very difficult situation. And I was relying on the counseling staff to meet with the teacher daily. And I remember the head counselor coming to me and saying, my staff can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
They're burning out. they can't, this needs to be a lawyer. And here I was as a head, I'm in a tough position because they're the best ones to go in there and do it, but I know it's negatively affecting them.
Absolutely right.
Do I do it like a sergeant in the army? Into the fray we go, right? So somehow we have to push our soldiers, but yeah, that was a turning point.
And again, that's one of those things that you'll never get right entirely, because decisions get made quickly. You're limited in terms of resources. Sometimes you have to make a decision incredibly quickly on a dime.
And without all the information.
Without all the information, yeah. One of the things that I've tried to do when a crisis hits, early on in the crisis, is to say, what's this looking like in 6 months? And work backwards from that.
Because you can't operate at crisis level for 6 months straight,
but
right?
The decisions you might make in the afternoon of the crisis or the next day are going to impact what it looks like in 6 months. Begin with the end in mind and work backwards, not that you have precise information of what it's going to look like, but when the stone gets thrown in the pond, I have worked in situations where people around me have been focused, understandably, on Ripple 2 or Ripple 3. I think part of our responsibility is to say, what's the 10, and come back from there. And I'll give you a tiny example, which we shared just the other day, casually. When I go back to the incident in India with a girl who died by suicide on the campus, a lot of our concern was invested, understandably, on the family, on her friends, on her teachers, etc. But I remember that one of the people that first found the girl was a member of the security team. And in the context of India, if you are a member of a security team at a school, you hang on to that job as much as you possibly can, because you typically come from a low-income background and you're very respectful of protocols. The next week, I sat down with the team and said, who's looking after her?
Yeah,
now, that doesn't mean that I did anything with particular foresight. It was probably an accidental thought. But I don't think organizationally we think about what's going to happen to her in 6 months when the trauma might kick in, or when something triggers,
to manifest,
or if she feels she's made a mistake in her. So there's a tremendous responsibility on us, I think, to think not only about, let me rephrase it, I think sometimes we can, as an organization, want it just to go away and think that by the end of the first week, if we've done this and this with some degree of fidelity and compassion, we're ready to move on. And I would advocate for a group of people working in the background in week 10 and 12 to say, okay, where are we? Let's feel the pulse. Let's bring these people in.
I think that's very powerful, because it's so easy to, once the cameras have been shut off, the crisis has dissipated, the social media has died down, to get back on with things and not to reflect back. One, what did we do right or wrong? What could we have done differently? And what are the lasting impacts? Where is this coming? And student or staff member suicide is probably two of the most powerful ones that happen inside schools. Yeah, those are challenging situations to deal with. I've had both in my career as well, and very challenging.
Yeah.
So what can schools be doing, though, to support staff members? Like you said, having someone working in the background to ask that question, what happens at Ripple number 10? But you don't really write that into a policy.
No, but I don't know. I can't give you a thorough answer as to what they can do beyond making it a legitimate commitment to the well-being of the adults as much as the students. Obviously, there are some very quite prosaic things you can do. Those policies, the practicing, the communications, partnering if you've got the resources with the crisis management team proactively as well as reactively. But I think to an earlier point, I'm going to pretend you're going to think momentarily that I've actually read the article. I haven't.
Okay.
But there was an article in the Harvard Business Review, which I understand is a magazine that comes out periodically, advocating that we look at safeguarding in any organization differently, that it's not just an adjunct. It is absolutely a sort of strategic engine for the success of the school or the organization. So I think possibly when we come up to accreditation, we tighten up our safeguarding policies and procedures. And we look at it as a sort of bureaucratic exercise, rather than saying, okay, let's start there. Safeguarding of children, the safeguarding of adults connected to our community, and focus our resources there, not entirely, of course, possibly more, and be creative and be risky in terms of how you deploy some resources. Because again, as we know, you take care of people, your outcomes, and outcomes in terms of the whole dashboard of outcomes, not just the academic outcomes.
Absolutely.
The well-being outcomes are.
The culture of the school, the feeling of the school, the retention of teachers, the retention of students, the sense of belonging, all go up when you have those things in place. And I think maybe let's just brainstorm some ways that schools could be putting this into place. We mentioned the practices and the drills. We do fire drills, we do lockdown drills, evacuation drills. I think we should be doing tabletop drills as well, and inviting in our deputies and vice principals and stuff as well, so that they see it, even if they're not participating in it. And you're doing, in certain areas, you might be doing a school shooter scenario, or it might just be a school violence scenario, or it might be, a staff member is in a tragic accident over a holiday. How do we respond? I think doing those kind of tabletop exercises and bringing in our younger leaders helps to share that load. Adding wellness clauses into contracts or into remuneration packages. We have our insurance packages. Sometimes they don't cover psychological benefits. And if they don't, then it can be a cash reimbursement if they submit a person a receipt. Or as you said, getting the permission to hire psychologists who actually just work with the staff or work with staff and students.
I know quite a few schools have partnered with the Truman Group. And again, they're excellent and not necessarily within the range of everyone's budgets, but at least that's an example of some sort of additional support you might be able to give to individuals or groups.
Yeah, and I think parents can support that. I did see one school that did I can't believe this, they announced staff sensory deprivation capsules.
Yes.
So that staff could go in and have sleep.
Perfect.
And I can see the benefit of it. Well-rested staff are good. I just don't know if parents are going to accept teachers having sleeping during their shift.
If I would very much doubt that any of my former, or the former leadership team in Beijing are watching this, unless they're insomniacs. But in an early conversation I had at Beijing was faculty lounge was awful, and that campus is not awful.
Yeah,
the faculty lounge is awful. And my wife is a former kindergarten teacher, and one of the things that she used to say with some frequency is, when I said, "How was your day?" and she used to say, "I didn't have time to go to the bathroom." She's not as polite as that. And what's my point? My point is that having a faculty lounge where you can rest, where you can have a quiet room, where you could have a sleep pod, it's going to be a tough sell to the board and the parents. That's where their money is going. But at the same time, going back to the notion of how demanding it is to be a primary school teacher or a teacher in general, where do we find innovative commitments based on research? I think, what was the Daniel Pink work he did about napping? The Power of Napping appears in one of his books, and productivity.
I'm going to make a note.
He came up with a term. It's not necessarily his term, but he uses the term the nappuccino. You have a cup of coffee, and then
there's a lot of cultures that do that on a daily basis, right?
So again, we go back to if we know it's good for people, why aren't we doing it? Now, obviously, there are multiple reasons. There's the parental pressure, there's the perception, there's the budgetary aspects. But I do think it pays for us to have very open, creative conversations about where are the margins beyond symbolism.
And I also think heads need to advocate for themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put this out there, and I'm going to keep saying this as much as I can to people, because there is a prime time, and that's when you're negotiating your contract. When you're going into a new headship, you're being offered a compensation package. I think heads should advocate a budget, an amount for a personal coach, whether it's a counselor, a therapist, a psychologist, or a life coach. That you should have that added in, because especially as heads, there's usually no one else to talk to. There may be related heads or friends outside of education, but the confidentiality piece, the full understanding piece, I think if we advocate for ourselves, we can get some of those things supported. And that'll help boards to understand. Hopefully boards will see the value of it. They'll start bringing that into the leadership packages, but we have to advocate for ourselves as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, completely. I think there's also scope for boards making sure that they have considering having former heads of school on their board. You think about the amount of experience that's out there now, retired, who can participate in board meetings from distance, who can give additional levels of accountability, but also support to heads of school.
Yes.
How many times have we had how many times have we had a conversation with the board where we really know that the answer is X, and yet we spend an awful lot of time talking about why, and one additional voice in the board who's an experienced educator might be able to press the balance.
Bring it back the other way.
But certainly having a coach who is not just online, I think, is someone who can actually come to the campus and spend time with that individual. The tension, therefore, might become that the board thinks they have access to the dialogue and the conversation. So there has to be some clear demarcation around that, about what the purpose is, and the purpose is to give that head of school a place for she or he to share some of the more challenging aspects.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that I advocate for all leaders, and this can be from teacher leaders to middle level leaders to senior leadership teams, is about improving their capacity. And the metaphor that I use, or this framework that I use, is I think we're often very good at what we're doing as teachers. Someone recognizes that, they think we'll be good for leadership, so they give us this responsibility load. Typically, we can handle it well because our capacity is greater than the load is. But that load is always going to grow. And what happens when that load or responsibility grows? Typically, we start sacrificing our health. We stop eating at lunch. We stop doing our workouts. That transfers over into our relationships, and we start to damage some of our relationships. Okay, maybe we'll go to some conferences and learn some leadership strategies or something. We're learning on the job, but our overall capacity is crumbling and decreasing, and we don't really recognize it. And I would even say we willingly sacrifice some of those things in order to keep doing the job. We don't recognize the impact until it affects the job. When all of a sudden, we blow up in a staff meeting because of our frustration, then we realize, oh, something's going wrong. And my hope is that we can back that up and get people building their overall fitness, mental, relational, and leadership capacities much earlier on. And then they're able to handle their current load and whatever the future load comes of.
Yeah, I think, again, you can scale that down to classroom teachers, particularly if they're working in an environment where there isn't that psychological safety in the school. They themselves will end up sacrificing one part of their life or eroding a particular relationship. So again, yes, and I think we need to consider those challenges for all of our colleagues in schools. And burnout at any level is real, and possibly we'd need some more data or anecdata in this, but possibly more so since COVID. And I maintain that the world, obviously, but certainly schools seem not to have fully recovered from the COVID period. I still, going back to that term, the ripples in the pond, I still think there's some rippling happening.
Yes.
I think parents are more jumpy than they have been. I think teachers have been more unsettled. And I think there was that beautiful moment in COVID, if that's the right term to use, when we all had these passionate conversations about doing less and doing it better. And that wonderful period when we were forced to not have traditional 3-hour exams in gymnasium. And we all made a sort of moral commitment to saying, okay, the world has taught us what matters. And then we raced back to where we were before and put some mustard on it as well.
And some mustard, there's some added guilt that there's this COVID loss.
Which is possibly true and also not the end of the world. So I don't think we've settled. The amplitude of the wave after COVID is still pretty significant. But burnout's real. I have encountered. I remember going to the ERCOS conference a few years ago. I applied late. I didn't get in. They wouldn't let me in. So I met up with some folks here and there, and roughly the same age. And in our conversations, I worked out that we all had a few things in common. And one was that we still believed in the power of education and that we were doing good work. We all had a place on the map that we thought was home, but we didn't know where it was or if we were sure about it. And we were exhausted. But not just in that physical sense,
Yeah. I think to bring a positive light on things,
That's not what this is about.
That's right.
You didn't tell me that.
I think I've been doing some podcasts recently with some the younger generation hosts, and I've been their guest, and I've been talking about the loneliness of leadership and the loss of capacity and sacrificing, the exhaustion. And it seems to me that some of the younger generation are aware of it and doing something about it already. Maybe it's because of COVID. Maybe it's because they're seeing our generation burnout, or they're just more intrinsically in tune to wellness overall. Whereas I think we were intrinsically in tune to achievement.
I admire the stance of what I would say is a generation or two, possibly below us, because they're much more ready to say no. And again, I was in a school environment once upon a time where that type of response was looked down upon. And I adopted a different approach, which was to say, if they don't say no, then they're giving us permission to do to them what was done to us, which is adding and adding, without taking anything away.
That's right.
And by the way, you must be lonely if you've asked me to spend the afternoon with me. It must be terrible. And that's just filling up that cup to the point of overflowing. And I believe that can get exacerbated by And we've all done it. A new administration coming in, deciding that this is something that has to happen this year without necessarily taking the time to take away
something.
or at least refine the work in order to make it achievable. If a teacher says to me, which they have done, I'm not going to do X, then fair enough. We need to find a way of accomplishing X or deciding that it's not required.
I think it needs to be very clear what's contractual, what's not contractual. Managing expectations is really important. No teacher likes surprises or additional uncompensated work. That's beyond reason. But I think education in general, we're very guilty of the add-on effect.
Yeah.
And we just add on and add on.
And we don't get creative around things like calendars. We still have the school calendar from the agrarian days. And there's a long stretch every now and then without us thinking, okay, how can we creatively take one of our vacation days and drop it in to alleviate some of the pressure here? Or again, what will be the response of the board and the parents and even the government if you decide to go to a year-round school calendar? Round school calendar is probably better for students and probably better for adults. Again, we think we know this and yet we continue to do that. So
there's lots of different possibilities, right? And what's great about all of this is that there are more and more of those conversations happening. Hopefully they'll start to translate into change. I think we're starting to see some change. Maybe just let's take a moment and share what you're going to be doing with 21st Century Learning and the 21CL coming up next year, 2027 in Hong Kong. We're going to be adding in a mental health and wellbeing strand. You're kind of taking charge of that or taking some leadership.
Yeah, I was very, very flattered, and I agree that we should probably not retire the notion of well-being, but make a distinct strand around mental health, because obviously there's a connection, correlation, but make it about what's the stark reality, not in sort of shock and awe, but what are the statistics around self-harm, suicidation with students and possibly with adults, but also how do we get creative, part of the discussion this afternoon, how do we get creative to alleviate some of the mental health crises in the micro and the macro, in the programming, what's the data showing us?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'm glad we're adding that into the conference. That'll really give us some set time and space and resources to have those important conversations and to make sure we bring the right people to the table. Because as you said, it's not just about counselors being there. It's heads and board chairs.
Yeah, the work the counselors do is extraordinary. And to your point, often in a crisis, we'll go to the counsellors and their function. I mean, I think they sit at the heart of the school, the beating heart of the school. And in that, we need to make sure that other people come to the dialogue as well to appreciate what the counsellor's role is day to day, but also in a crisis. Again, we can send the counsellors off to be the heroes sometimes, and what impact does that have on them, to your point earlier? Absolutely, yeah.
Good. We're almost out of time. I really want to challenge people that are listening or watching us, unfortunately for them, to keep this conversation going. And if they have some ideas or strategies that they've seen work in their schools, in their organizations, share them in the comments. And let's keep this conversation going, ultimately culminating in the conference in Hong Kong. And hopefully even before then, maybe we'll do an online symposium or an online discussion, a live chat, where we can invite people to keep talking about this, because I think in the past we haven't talked about it enough. But the impact that it will make on students, on our organizations, is huge, and it really warrants the conversation and the time.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you, Patrick, for joining me today.
Nice to see you again.
And wonderful time, and look forward to doing this again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Good to see you.